Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 2018 OE webinar series. Today we have a webinar entitled From Difficult to Developmental, Reframing Hard Conversations as Growth Opportunities with Stephanie Hefner from here at the University of Oregon. I'm going to ask everybody, if you have your sound on, just mute yourselves. I'm going to mute myself as well, and Stephanie will be the main one talking. Just a heads up, I will also be helping Stephanie with any sort of monitoring the chat box, so feel free to write in, type in any sort of questions you have throughout, and I'll be helping with that. Along with that, I should mention I'm Cherie Spun. I'm the Director of Education for OE, so thanks for joining us. I wanted to go into the next part. So OE education. So as Director of Education, I have several things I'm responsible for. So along with the webinar series, I manage our blog. So all of you as OE members or people who are interested in OE have an opportunity to write a blog post for us related to our values or the mission and vision of the organization. I would encourage you to do that if you're interested. It's a great opportunity to both practice your writing skills and also share your voice with the community. So that's super cool. We also have an OE book club, and we have 2 books that were established to read this year at the conference. So we already read Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And early this fall, we're going to read Difficult Women. It's a very good book. It's also a very difficult book in some different ways. So I'm excited to chat with people about that book. Other webinars we have coming up, we actually have one every month through the end of the year. So in September, we have a webinar on dimensions of culture and influences in higher education. In October, we're going to learn about the basics of finance and salary negotiation. In November, we have fostering inclusive and body positive culture for students and staff in higher education. And then in December, we have a Gender 101 webinar that is going to get also into specifics of pronoun use in higher education. So we're really excited about all that. Again, my name is Charisse, and I'm managing the chat box for Stephanie. And with that, I'm actually going to hand it over to Stephanie.
Thanks, Charisse. It's really exciting to see what kind of stuff is coming up for the webinars. I can already think of a few I want to sign up for, so thank you so much. I'm going to ask that you all have a little bit of patience with me. This is my first time using Zoom, so I'm feeling pretty good about it, but if something seems off, please let Charisse know, and Charisse, please speak up if I get a little wonky somewhere. What I would like to do is basically kind of preface where this presentation came from and kind of the background that both of the creators had going into it. So this was made with one of my cohort members while I was still in grad school, and us, myself, Stephanie Hefner, and Linda Alexander, both of us had differing backgrounds, but we're going to grad school for college student services. So Linda Alexander did a lot of career advising and for Greek life, so fraternity and sorority life kind of work, and I did a background in academic advising, and during my grad school experience actually had my first experience in student conduct and communication, student conduct and community standards. So that allowed me, Yep. Okay, great. Thanks, Charisse, for saying that. If you have any questions, please do type it in the box. This is really informal, so I'd love to get to questions if you have them as we go along. So, so I had the background of student conduct, and going through this, I just kind of realized that conflict and difficult situations and hard conversations about a variety of topics are hard and they don't necessarily get easier, but how can we prep each other in the work that we do and even as individuals to see that these difficult situations are absolutely an opportunity to grow and to create meaning with each other and to make our relationships deeper and to make basically our toolbox of what we can do in hard conversations and difficult situations feel less like it's empty and we're not sure what the right thing to pull out is when we're needing to kind of pivot or have a specific need met or represent ourselves. So what I'm going to kind of go through here is talk a little bit about a bunch of different theories. So here's some goals, some learning goals all spread out, but really what this webinar is going to be about is here's a variety of things we could talk about when it comes to difficult conversations. So why do we engage in them? What can be interesting about them or difficult about them in a group? And what are the kind of methods that push us towards conflict or push us away from conflict, and how we navigate those together in our community or in our office or even just in groups of friends. And then talking maybe a little bit more down into the individual one-on-one patterns we could see when you're actually in those moments, and maybe the actions we could use when we're in those moments to kind of manage the conversation more effectively. And we're definitely going to pull in some resources at the end. What I do want to say is this presentation is definitely going to be best kind of sunk in after you come away from it. So it's going to be a lot of word vomit in the beginning, and I did have some suggestions at the end of this presentation for ways to reflect and practice with yourself and maybe come back to this, see what resonates with you, what doesn't, what do you have questions with, because I do recognize that this is just scratching the surface of things that could be helpful. So these are the goals, and just mention some of the theories, and we're just hoping that eventually by the end of this you'll feel like you've supplemented some of your skills you already have and your resources to engage in difficult conversations and hard situations. So something I want to mention is, why do these conversations matter to begin with? So by engaging in difficult dialogue, you assist in shaping office culture and create personal progress. So engaging in authentically difficult issues together, acknowledging the complexity of every individual's needs and the context of these conversations, makes everyone a more empathetic and more creative communicator. So every single thing you go into, even if it doesn't end up perfect, even if things could have gone better, it's still a transformational experience, not just for you, but for the other parties and for your community. And I just want to reiterate, it's okay to want to avoid these conversations, whether it's with a student that you really care about but you have a difficulty with, whether it's a boss or a colleague, whether it's with a family member. It's normal to want to avoid this because no one really thrives or craves the discomfort that comes along with it. We might be okay with it, but we're never like, let me jump into that. And the reasons why is because we're human, and they are hard, and human nature is to sometimes discount or defend against or deflect anything that's difficult or challenging. And even if it isn't perfect or it isn't easy, it's still really important because dialogue itself, whether it goes poorly, whether it goes perfectly, has the inherent value in helping us discover and at times create new capacities for understanding and lasting relationships. And I think that's, at the end of the day, like what we want to come out of every single difficult situation or conversation is enhanced understanding and growth in our relationships. And I really do think that's possible no matter what really happens within those. And so I just want to reiterate, it's hard. I hear that. I think we've all been part of something, maybe avoiding the issue for a while, and why it's important to sometimes enter into these spaces that might make us feel a little uncomfortable, but they're still worth our time and worth our effort. So kind of moving into that, I wanted to talk a little bit about human relations theory. And this is kind of looking at, in the industrial era, there was a study called the Hawthorne studies in the 1920s and 1930s. And it was basically looking at how to make humans, like a group, more efficient, like a machinery. So how to get the best productivity out of them. And what it actually came out with is that fundamentally, people desire to be part of a supportive team that facilitates development and growth. This means that individualized attention and care from supervisors, coworkers, team members was shown to create motivation, sense of belonging, and happiness. And so when we look at conflict through human relations theory, we get to look at the group or community instead of just the one-on-one conflict. So two key concepts that are highlighted as being influential on conflict in this lens is the culture that's kind of around you and a communication that's around you. So if there's a mismatch in culture or communication, oftentimes that can breed conflict. And that's not to say that those differences are wrong or that they'll automatically breed conflict, but rather that these things are good to be aware of when you're in your group. And also it's good to be aware of in a group how it's kind of been shown that everyone in a group, with the really invested in these relationships, really does want to be challenged, wants to have these sense of belonging, this care, this attention. And when we talk about if we have a difficulty with someone, showing care and attention typically isn't avoiding that difficulty. It's typically sitting down and having that investment with that person and saying, I'm here and I'm here to care. And whether or not that's going to go super smoothly, I still want you to know I hear you and I respect you and I'm working through this with you. And that can not only help your relationship, but also the productivity in office, the way that you guys create meaning together. And I think that that's really important. I also kind of want to point out that one of the ways they can get rid of that culture mismatch or the communication mismatch is having a low risk way to basically interact with meaning. So I kind of like to bring this up as an example. When I was reading human relations theory, it said, hey, have a place where everyone can get together and have a low risk situation where they can ask questions about things that they might have differences on without being really forced. And immediately what came to my mind is anytime we've ever been to a staff retreat and we're like, this is great, but why aren't we at our desk doing things? Or this is great, but I'm not really sure what the point is. And I think a lot of times those spaces are made and protected for us so that we do have that opportunity to connect, to create meaning together, to maybe navigate some of those smaller hiccups before they do become conflict, and to help exercise basically our human relations theory and our group ability to move through those mismatches together. You notice here on the screen, this triangle on the left is actually a depiction of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And just as a brief overview, that hierarchy of needs basically says that before we can move on to the next stage of our lives, the next stage of our needs, we have to make sure our base is met. So you can see at the bottom there's health, food, and sleep. Safety, so shelter, removal from danger, and that belonging piece. So when we talk about human relations theory and helping that support belonging through conflict mitigation and through basically that desire to have that investment in each other, that's where we could really feed into it. And if we see that this is done successfully, not only are we helping our team or helping the university or helping our productivity, we're also creating a better, stronger layer for each person to have stronger self-esteem and to achieve their individual potential. So I do want to highlight that this isn't always about, I did come out of the industrial era, so it does talk a little bit about how to make the most efficient team, but I really see it as being an integral part of really fostering that belonging piece of each individual when they're a part of a community or part of an office. So if we move along to a little bit beyond just the groups and the theories behind the groups, but also the spaces that we operate in, I know that safe spaces is something that has kind of been talked about a lot more recently. And so that safe space is the idea of, just a second. So it's basically an idea that you can relate to diversity, social justice, and learning environments, and they take this definition of safety from the Webster's Dictionary as being able to enter into those difficult conversations, being free from harm or risk, affording safety or security or danger or difficulty, and making sure that you're unlikely to produce controversy that would be directly incompatible with safety. And so something that we were reading by Brian and Arrow Clemens basically said that, that's nice, safe spaces, I'm not saying we need to get rid of them, that those people who are marginalized or underrepresented, who have real lived experiences should be protected and respected and uplifted. However, isn't the very nature of going into a difficult conversation going to have risk? Isn't the very nature of trying to ask these difficult questions inherently have a little bit of difficulty? And if so, those things really don't align with the words safe. And what they're really aligning with is perhaps the word brave. And so Arrow and Clemens like to call out that maybe brave spaces is more what we mean, is more maybe applicable. So authentic dialogue often requires these qualities of risk, difficulty, and controversy. And they're particularly unavoidable when members are different from one another. And I think virtually every human on this planet is going to be different from one another in one way. So we're all going to have courage in different parts of our relationships. So I really do think that Arrow and Clemens explain that choosing to engage in challenging dialogue in the first place is just never going to be a low-risk decision. So if it's never going to be a low-risk decision, and it's really difficult to promise that safety and growth in the same place, brave spaces are actually maybe the more successful option for us. So when we talk about safety being a good thing, but it also gives us limitations. And I really like this quote from Arrow and Clemens that says, in order to learn, you have to have risk. And it's actually that risk of pain to give up something that you thought was true in favor of a new perspective or a new way of seeing things. And that kind of vulnerability and that bravery and that courage is really what we might be looking for when we enter into these difficult conversations. So I would encourage us to, if you thought of safe spaces before and you really felt like that resonated with you, I am not saying you need to toss it out the door, but kind of think about the limitations and the benefits of that framework and how shifting it in certain ways might provide actually more space for development and growth and understanding. So when we've talked about the group and we've kind of talked about space and kind of the culture in which you set up those difficult conversations to happen, I do want to bring up starting points. So starting points are kind of a concept that was discussed by Dr. Larry Roper, and he says that as people, we have inherent motivations, expectations, values, experiences, and we never shed them at the door. You simply can't show up in a space without having all of these things attached to you and who you are and your individual personality in your experience. And so I think when we're about to go into difficult situations, or you know you're going to be put in a place that might be challenging for you, that analyzing your own starting points would be really important. For an example, I was actually had a colleague the other day, and we were just chatting in the hallway, kind of having a good little time together, and she just on the offhand said, I think the most important thing in life is to be nice to people. And we kind of chatted about that, and I was like, oh, really? You think nice? And she's like, yes, I think at the root, all you should have to do is be nice to someone else. And that's really important to me, and that's what I believe. And I said, oh, well, I kind of believe that I understand where you're coming from, but I think showing care to people is the most important thing in my life. So even if I can't be nice to you, if that's me showing you care and really calling out some things I feel like are concerning, then I'm going to do that. And that's going to be my personal tenet. And she kind of shook her head and said, well, no, I don't agree with that. Niceness is better than everything. And to be fair, I had been working with this person for about 8.5 months and had no idea that this was her primary value and how she attached meaning to people and meaning to basically her interactions is the niceness level. And we could have continued on like that and would have potentially created a lot of dissonance and some of the things I thought I was doing to demonstrate care, but she saw as perhaps being directly antithetical to what she thought was a good person, which was being nice. And those values, I feel like you can't really guess. So the top 3 values that guide everything you do, you might know your best friend's top 2, you might know your mom's first one, but I think it's really, really hard to look at someone, even for a long time after you've known them, and know what 3 things are guiding every single action they make in every single scenario. And they probably shift. And so I think it's really important to think about those points for ourselves, because I think that self-reflection will help us be more grounded in why we're making the choices we are, and being able to represent ourselves authentically, our institutions authentically, and maybe the actions we're putting forth. Because we all have roles, and those roles are going to change depending on how we are in the room. So I think before you have difficult conversations or situations, take a moment to articulate what parts of your identity or role are going to show up in the situation most. So is your motivation perhaps to care for the student? Is that number 1? Is it to maintain the safety of your housing community? Is it both? If it is, how do you balance those? And how could you see either one coming out or being in conflict? And so these starting points, yeah, I've talked a lot about how they're important for you to reflect on in order to center your responses, but they're also important to remember as we are usually in conflict with another fully fledged individual who has all of their own starting points. And I'm sure many of us have had an encounter with either a student or with another colleague who might be struggling socially, academically, or even in their behavior. But once you've actually started a conversation about how they are and the behavior, the concerning things that are you're aware of, sometimes students will actually point out a bunch of other factors that are taking a toll on their ability to regulate schoolwork or emotions. So it can be the interest for you and the person you're working with to try to find out more about their starting points, or at least being sensitive to all the things you do not know about the situation or do not know about the person. And some ways you can kind of mitigate this, because you're never going to know everything, is if you know a little bit about someone, to try to do some extra resource hunting or a little bit of research into it. So if you know that a person that you're going to have a discussion with identifies as part of the LGBTQAI plus community, maybe just a little bit of research about the campus resources or cool events or community things that are going around that aspect of the identity could be useful to further understand something that is actually outside of your experience before entering into a hard situation with that student. And it's important not to reduce all of these other individuals down to one element of their identities that we may know about, but rather this little bit of peeking into other things and other parts of their identity is to basically expand our ability not to communicate, but just to understand the other pieces of the human elements. And if by chance it does come up, you're able to basically wrap that student or wrap that person in more in your interaction than just the difficult pieces. So maybe you have an off chance that you showcase your knowledge and your care because you do get to bring up something. It's not something we're going to bring out as like a 100%, this is something that's going to show that I care about you, but it's more about growing your understanding of what you do know about them and being very sensitive to what you don't know. And I think that if you can do that in every situation, or at least be really aware and have that active reflection, you'll find yourself being a lot more grounded and being caught a lot less on the back foot of kind of what you're representing and why that's important. And yes, I know that we're friends, but that can't be the focus of this conversation because my role is this. And it allows us to not necessarily compartmentalize, but prioritize and know that in our heart, that's kind of how we need to show up in this room and how we are going to show up in this room. So I think that starting point's a really great way to help mitigate a little bit of the confidence issue or a little bit of not sure how the situation will go. We can't be in control of everything. We can't even always be in control of everything we're going to feel in that moment, but we can at least analyze it before we go in there and feel a little bit better about what we could expect. So as we kind of go forward, we know that starting points are important and they're individual. But there are other things that are going to impact how we show up in a space. So your group dynamics, the history, the politics, all of that. The cultural dynamics, the way we show up with a student and perhaps how we perceive their cultural norms and ours matching or mismatching. And we did talk about that earlier with human relations theory as not being 100% going to cause conflict, but it can lend to miscommunication. So we just want to be aware of those things. Assumptions, so it's a starting point piece, right? When we assume we know everything about a person, or we assume that we know even something about them that they haven't either confirmed or explained to us and we haven't tried to understand, that can cause a lot of issues, even about maybe you're assuming you know what their emotions are on the topic, or you're assuming you know where they stand and we haven't actually started the conversation, but yet you're coming in with all of these held preconceived notions. And then the context. So sometimes having a difficult discussion with someone in a closed room, in a place that you feel pretty close and safe, is going to be way different than having that difficult situation pop up when you're at lunch with the whole office and you're trying to manage each other's reputation. And so I just want to recognize that all of those things impact how we'll actually be able to act on what we want to do in a difficult conversation or situation, and they should all be taken into account. And there isn't, I guess we're getting back to the point, there isn't one way to do it right. These are all just parts of the things we want to consider. So when we move forward into a little bit more about the actual individual conflict styles, this is narrowing it down even more. So we've talked about kind of the group, the space, ourselves, but then also how are we going to be able to interact, or what might we see in a conflict that we could kind of identify and then go, oh, this isn't working the way I want it. How do I shift it? And so Ting, Toomey, and Oetzel talk about individual conflict styles, and these conflict styles are arranged on a scale from more assertive to less assertive and more cooperative to less cooperative. And assertive is not necessarily bad. What it is assertiveness is the degree to which a person is concerned with meeting their own needs and interests, and cooperation is the degree in which the person desires to incorporate the needs of others. So both are acceptable. Both happen and are determined based on the context of the situation, like we talked about before, as well as the people involved and the additional circumstances that may have come up. So self-interest is not necessarily what you want. It's not necessarily what you don't want. It's based on the expectations of your goals, your vision, your mission. Sometimes your office, department, or institution will also impact how maybe assertive you are in a situation or cooperative. So to give a little bit more detail, we have this is what the kind of conflict looks like. So dominating on that thing would be considered pushing for one's own interest above and beyond the interest of others. Avoiding, eluding the conflict topic, the other party in the conflict or the conflict situation. So I know personally, I've definitely done the avoiding thing. I've definitely done the dominating thing too. Obliging is being concerned with the other person's conflict interest above and beyond one's own. I can definitely see the obliging conflict style come out in me, especially when I'm working with close friends or family who I might have issues with. Compromising, a give and take to reach a middle ground agreement. So you both give up something in order to find a new conclusion that you can work together on. And integrating is high collaborative, and it's a high concern for self and a high concern for others. So with integrating, you might actually want to have an integrating type of conflict style, but that could mean that that's what you want, but you kind of oscillate between avoidance strategies, engagement strategies, because you're not willing to give any ground and you're not willing to give the other person any ground. And so that can be kind of like more of a, if we think about the horns being locked and both bulls just kind of pushing at each other and not giving any way, that would be integrating. And that's not to say that it's a bad thing. As long as the bull's being locked, eventually they figure out what they're doing together and they go together with both of their heads in the right direction. So I think these types of conflict, we might have some initial kind of gut reactions to what we think is a good one and what we think is a bad one. But I do want to reassert there's no value, no like judgment value associated with any of these. It's really going to be more about what do you notice is happening, is that what you want to happen? And if you can realize that that is kind of the pattern you're following, can you make a conscious effort to change it? Can you notice in other people the conflict styles they are more prone to? Could you perhaps work with that or talk to them about it, or at least know what to expect in order to be more effective in your communication with them and your conflict with them? I do want to this is kind of a nice little color code of what's going on with these styles. So we have the high assertiveness, high cooperation, and then the purple in the middle kind of shows you how well they are mixed or how high of one thing is to another. And what I want to iterate with this is you notice all the white squares. So not all realities actually fit in this nice little box. Not all realities or conflicts are going to be able to be labeled so nicely, and very rarely do they just fit in one section. So what this is about is more about helping you realize, again, what the pattern of what is happening is. Is that what you expected? Is that different? Do you find yourself when you are confronted with certain topics, do you have a tendency to use one of these more than the other? And how do you consciously try to shift, if you can, into creating an atmosphere or something that's more in alignment with what you want it to happen or what you're hoping will happen? So I really do like that this is a good toolbox for vocabulary and to kind of describe what you might be seeing instead of just going, well, they're avoiding me. I mean, avoiding is a word, but you could kind of look at that as a conflict style instead of a personal affront. Maybe that person is choosing this or not choosing this or is prone to this and needs some kind of coaching into how to do that differently. Additionally, if you notice someone is dominating, it might mean they have a really high value on what they need to accomplish, and trying to kind of connect with them on the values they associate and the importance of what they're trying to accomplish could perhaps tone them down enough so they feel heard, and you can kind of re-enter that situation if needed after you've addressed that they do have a high need to meet their needs and that it's kind of overwhelming everyone else. We are going to move forward into the actual, we talked about individual kind of conflict styles and now actionable items. So this is things we could actually do while we are in our conversations, and this will take practice, and it's probably not going to be something you have a little checklist on your desk while you're having these conflicts come up. But Paul Axtell identifies strategies and specific actions to promote meaningful conversations. So here's some of the general principles on the left he suggests, and specific ways you can implement those principles on the right. I do like this because I think a lot of times we say, just listen respectfully. And while that can come naturally to a lot of us, some of us don't really know the actual things we should be doing action-wise to show that we're doing that. So Paul kind of breaks it down. So manage our conversations so they are effective. Involves having one conversation at a time, one person speaking at a time, and have, if necessary, someone else manage the conversation so that they're there to kind of be the agenda setter and talk about what the outcomes in the process were so you don't get off track. And you want to be definitive about closure. So if you're managing a conversation, you should both be aware of when it's over. So where are we when we have to maybe hit pause and when we're done? And what do we expect to happen next? And so it's going to be really important to have those kind of wrap-up pieces. Listening respectfully and generously means paying attention to what the person is saying, allowing them to finish. If you have any doubt that you understood, just verify your understanding and acknowledge different perspectives. So just because you're acknowledging that you heard what the other person says doesn't mean you still have to agree with them, right? So you could say, I am hearing that you value this and this and this. I really appreciate you sharing that with me. I want to acknowledge that you're holding that point of view and it's important to you. I hope that you can hear me when I say blah, 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 blah. So just showing that you're actually actively listening and you're being able to reframe a little bit of what they're saying so they do feel heard. So communicate with each other completely. So if you're not aligned, you can say you're not aligned. If something doesn't work, you can say it doesn't work. It's not going to be an additional aggressive component. What it's actually going to help is be more productive. So when you're in conflict, you're not stuck in the conflict, you're moving towards solution. So if you aren't aligned, that's going to come up later. It's going to be a conflict again if you don't handle it now. If something doesn't work, you're just going to have this conversation again later. And if it's okay if you think it's going to work and it's not going, like later you figure out isn't going to. It's just important to communicate that as soon as you realize it's happening. You want to build those open communication. So even if you all aren't necessarily on the same page about a conflict or situation, there's mutual trust that you're going to say what you need and represent that and be heard, and vice versa. And this is part of making and keeping commitments with one another. So be specific about what your commitments are. So you'd basically want to say, perhaps with a student, you've told me that you will get me this paper by Wednesday, revised, and if you do that, I will make sure the grade is in the book by Saturday, something like that. And make sure if your commitment is in danger of not being fulfilled on time, again, communicate that. What we don't want to do is make someone feel like you're purposefully untrustful or not able to follow through on your side of things. And so part of that is just going to be making sure you're always really upfront about what kind of things are impacting your ability to follow through and communicating effectively about that. So you want to be on each other's side, and it's kind of what we talked about before with the bulls locking heads. So it might seem like they're on opposite sides, but they probably both have the same goal or something they could accomplish together, both strengths together, and if they just turn their heads outward. So managing each other's reputation, being supportive and helpful, really identifying that a lot of the conflict that might come up isn't really a personal affront or personal attack or something someone's trying to do to be harmful on purpose. Usually there's a lot of things behind that could perhaps be explored more and then really talked out. And so you guys can come to the same understanding of what could be productive. You want to be inclusive, invite people who may have interest or want to contribute, and look out for the interests of the group or the university. So again, just making sure that, hey, if you guys have a conflict about something and you have different opinions, is there another coworker or another expert on campus or someone who might have expertise on this? We can ask their opinion. We can invite them to this conversation. Part of that can be make it more collaborative and say, hey, I'm not trying to trust necessarily my opinion over yours. I'm trying to get to the best solution. And this is why I think mine might be that way, but let's talk with other people and see if we can figure that out and come to the same conclusion. Acknowledge and appreciate each other. So look out for what can be acknowledged. Tell people you appreciate about them and be authentic. So don't just hand out willy-nilly compliments because you think it's going to butter them up, because I definitely have seen that before. But it's, again, very rarely that we just absolutely, to the root of our core, have nothing good to say about each other, nothing good to say about a situation or conflict. Typically, you could really appreciate the way someone speaks up for what they believe in, even if you don't agree for what they believe in about a particular solution or scenario. With the students, perhaps you can really acknowledge and appreciate that they've showed up today, that maybe to a meeting, maybe that's the minimum you're going to get from them, but you really appreciate that they're acknowledging and respecting your time, and you're glad to have this time together, even if maybe it's not going to be the end-all be-all solution that they are wanting. All of those things can help the other party, again, feel like we're on the same side. We are acknowledging what we appreciate about the other person, giving effort and trust and communication back into this scenario, even if it's a hard and difficult scenario to be in. And so I think just really building each other up where we can authentically will reinforce that relationship and reinforce that cooperation. Being aligned with our strategic intent and current projects. So again, this is just being in alignment. Acknowledge if progress is slow or stops, and making sure you keep resources and energies focused. This can sometimes just be not less of a conflict thing and more of like we're in a meeting and we all get off talking about our weekends and what we really need to do is tackle this thing because it's been on your mind forever and we haven't really come to a conclusion about it. That is still a good way to make sure your meetings are being meaningful and you're avoiding conflict in the future and developing that group meeting making. So I think it's a really good idea to keep that in mind. So practice transparency and sharing information. Ask for what you need. Don't be afraid to say it. Don't be afraid to be clear, and anticipate what others might need. So if you say, like, I need this in order to get this done, and they're kind of going, okay, and they're about to leave the conversation, being able to stop that and go, so what can I do to support you? Do you need anything? And maybe the answer is no, or maybe it's not really anything you can help with. But again, that feeling heard, that being collaborative is going to go miles towards helping the resolution come together and be a very strong and positive experience, a growth opportunity. So beyond all of those actionable items, right, and beyond even the group, we live in communities and campuses that have resources available that can help us with these sort of difficult situations. So I've just listed off a few. There's many more usually. Mediation services sometimes can be on campus, sometimes in the community. Sometimes it can just be inviting that third friend in who knows both of you and can talk about the topic a little bit more or just hold that agenda setting for you, like we talked about last slide. Mentorship and professional networks, using Oregon and higher education mentors or someone in your office that you trust, someone who might have had a similar conflict in the past. How did they navigate a situation? Always really good to kind of talk it out and hear what their advice would be and maybe what they did that worked and what they did that didn't work and how does that apply to your scenario. Counseling and psychological services can be available on many campuses, and they are usually happy to consult about difficult situations you might be having with students around mental health or substance abuse or anxiety, any of those things. So you can even call them sometimes, depending on the time of day, and kind of run through some scenarios or ask to invite them into a staff meeting and do a quick run through of things that have been on your mind, things you've kind of ran into before you didn't quite know how to handle, and talk it out with them and do that little scenario of debrief, which can really help us feel more confident in the future. Educating through coursework, professional development, or online research are all great options. So there's no one way to do this right. There's no one way to feel great about it. As you can see, we just went through like 5 different theories and options, and that's just barely scratching the surface. So if you find something, a keyword or person or something I mentioned made you kind of resonate a little, but you want to look more into it, go for it. Maybe that's going to be your thing. That's your niche. That's going to be your handy dandy tool belt, and you're always going to have it on you. And you could do that through coursework if you wanted to take like a counseling class and that resonates more. If you like the structure, you could do professional development. So doing a little more webinars around things around difficult conversations, or maybe specific situations you've kind of come into contact with and you want to dive in more into those strategies. You could use the ombuds office if you have one on campus, and that would be basically a totally neutral party that helps adjudicate, well, not really even adjudicate, helps kind of mediate and be a part of the process of 2 parties of the university having a conflict with one another or needing to talk something out. They are trained in order to help each party through that and keep neutral records, so it can be a really great way to have that facilitated by someone in a way that they're trained and everything's neutral and you don't have to worry about it kind of going further. Student conduct and community standards can be a great place too, much for the same reason counseling and psychological services are. They can do consulting. They can tell you about, hey, this behavior is concerning. This is how you could talk to them. This is when it rises to the level of maybe a violation and we can step in. Do you want someone there? And the Department of Public Safety or your local police enforcement can also be helpful depending on how your relationship with them. Oftentimes, if you're nervous about a conversation, they can come and hang outside of the building. They can make sure that they talk you through different ways to de-escalate someone. I know that our current public safety, we're going to go to de-escalation training, and they even have sometimes the ability to run through scenarios with you or debrief really difficult situations. I think there are other ways to kind of mitigate some of the safety concerns, right? Using an Outlook or iCal, a calendar you have, and making sure that where you are and who you're meeting with is on your calendar if you can do that. Making sure you contact a local office and say, hey, I'm going to be meeting with this person. If you could just leave your door open so you can hear if voices get raised, I'd really appreciate it. You can have someone scheduled to check in on you if you're actually a little nervous, and have someone scheduled to knock on the door 15 minutes in and make a little comment that's totally just not even relevant, but then just to make sure you have that break and have someone check in on you. You could always also ask to do a meeting in a place that you feel safer in. So if you don't want to invite someone into your office, it's closed, or you don't like where it is there a potential way you could go that would make the whole thing feel a little bit less intense or a little more diffused and help your safety? I know as women in higher education, we definitely want to be aware of the space we take up in a room, all of the routes to a door in case things do escalate. And I do highly believe that taking care of those things first is needed, just like in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. How can we possibly expect you to navigate a difficult situation successfully if you're not even sure of your safety? So please do what you need to take care of yourself with that. So this is kind of how I put it all together-ish. So the context and resources that surround every conflict are around there. And we have the reflection piece. So what are the known and unknown starting points? What type of conflict style is most likely to happen? And is that in alignment with what you want to happen? Act. So should you contact resources, learn more, attempt to create an environment and preparation that encourages difficult situation success? And while in the situation, maybe practice using Axtel's actionable items as much as you find them applicable. Make them kind of, might be a little weird at first, but kind of make them in your back pocket, have a few favorite ones you like, practice them out in different scenarios, see what goes well, what doesn't. And then at the end, you want to assess what went well. You can always ask the other person too, like, hey, how do you feel this conversation went? How do you know it went well? So what kind of markers told you while you were going through the process that things were being productive so you could keep an eye out for them again? And how could you better handle a situation in the future based on what you've learned? Is there any follow-up needed? So do you need to touch base with other resources, call Department of Public Safety? Do you need to just follow up with a student after a certain period of time? Is there an email you need to send, notes you need to make? And I really do know that the arrows didn't go all the way around, but I do think this is a cycle, right? So we could assess and then go back to reflect. So even after we've had this big situation, what are still the unknown starting points? And if the conflict is over, we don't need to assess that style, but we could say, hey, is that conflict style that actually happened? Is that what I expected, or did something crazy happen and we didn't really acknowledge that that was going to be part of the scenario? And so beyond the workshop here, beyond the webinar, I like to give you these questions. So there's this right here, which I think is still going to be really helpful, but I also wanted to give some practice questions for just before you're in a difficult situation. So think about one you've had in the past or one you're going to have in the future, and answer some of these questions to yourself. So what emotions come up immediately when you think about the situation? Anxiety, anger, frustration. Why are you feeling those reactions? So getting to the root of, do you feel misunderstood? Do you feel brushed off? Are you feeling a legitimate misalignment with mission? Like what you think is important, what someone else does? What do you know about the situation? So what do, in your mind and your perspective, are the facts? And what do you feel like you don't know about the situation or the other person or the other parties? So keeping in mind like what might be affecting them that you don't know about. What is your ideal outcome or the ideal process of this conflict? And then what do you feel like is the most likely outcome and process of this conflict? And how to maybe bridge that gap or at least bring your ideal and likely closer together and your expectations closer together as well. What are the resources that you have available to you in terms of people, in terms of offices, all of those things to maybe help you navigate a lot of the situation that you might be nervous about. And then I like at the end of this to come up with what 3 intentional steps you can take to understand the unknowns, be prepared, support yourself and the other party towards developmental resolutions. So don't have to cram all of these theories and all of these practices into every single situation. But I think this process of thinking about these questions, even with past situations, can help you identify like, okay, these are the 3 actionable things I can do. Maybe 2 of them I'm going to do before, like those are my prep steps, and then 1 I'm going to do after. You figure out how it works for you. Maybe some will be really natural to come up with, and there'll be something you stick with almost every single conflict. And maybe you might be a person who likes to really tailor these to each situation you have, because it really does depend on what your work looks like and what conflict situation you might have going on. So we've gotten to the end here, and these are my references, but I definitely just wanted to say again that all of these pieces will be combined in so many different ways and layers to hopefully build your confidence in being able to enter into these conversations, knowing if they're going well, and feeling like it's value added, even if they're not perfect, value added to you, value added to your community, and value added to the other person. And I really hope that you kind of do a little more exploration on your own, see which one of these resonate with you, and continue to practice these in a way that makes sense so that you can become even a stronger individual when entering into these situations and conversations. If anyone has any questions, I'm more than happy to take them, but thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. That was great. Does anybody want to, if you have any questions, you can feel free to write them into the group chat.
Yeah.
I had a kind of general question for this, and have you ever worked in a place, or have you seen a good model for like a department that you've worked in where it was almost like the precedent was set to have difficult conversations and to kind of step into them knowing that it's growth? Or have you not worked do you have any ideas of how to set that up, and or have you worked in an environment where it was kind of a known fact that was okay?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like I haven't had the perfect experience in any particular office, but I do think that smaller groups, like smaller teams, have lended themselves to those difficult conversations being brave more. So the current office I'm in is pretty small, but I also consider our relationships pretty close. And that close relationship has allowed everyone to feel like, you know, we know each other too well, we care about each other too much to just leave things unsaid, even if we disagree. And that kind of like, I guess, assumed empathy and assumed like you have my best interests at heart has allowed us to navigate a lot of changes and difficulties together, not always being on the same page, but assuming good intent. And so I think that if we were going to try to make it an intentional choice that this is the precedent, this is what I believe my office should do, I think actually making it a point to have at least once a year maybe a staff meeting or group presentation or something like that, where you're asked to talk about difficult conversations, either with some of these theories that I mentioned or other ones that you feel like your office resonates with more. And perhaps, I think, resetting that precedent over and over again and being the brave one first, because I know we talk about safe spaces and brave spaces. Sometimes it takes showing people that it's okay and that things don't fall apart before they really get on the bandwagon. And it's a little bit of a difficulty to be vulnerable and to put yourself out there. And I think leadership, when they do that, when directors or assistant directors can do that first, they really do lead the pack, because everyone sees that not only is that something that's okay, but it's something my supervisor actively participates in and is modeling that for me.
Thank you very much.
Good question. Wouldn't that be the dream? Every office.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess I have, I've worked in several different offices, and I remember when I look back, one of my most, I guess, influential, and the person I look back to as a mentor even is a person who encouraged the difficult conversations all the time. Like, not all the time, but she was really encouraging it. And we learned, like, our whole job was focused on growth and professional development. And I found, like, in retrospect, like now, I'm like, oh my gosh, that was amazing, because every conversation, even if it could be difficult, like, it was like stepping into it. And it was really like, I grew so much during that experience. And then I've worked in a lot of very different environments where any sort of, like, it's not even a confrontation, any sort of disagreement, or like if somebody says something and you counter with an argument, there's like an automatic kind of like step back, or like, you know, and that seems to be the norm in most of my recent experiences, which it's kind of interesting.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's definitely a shift if you've gone from one to the other and you're like, wait.
Yeah. We have another question. So one of the participants said, my department's management team are primarily made up of a bunch of technical, introverted people. What tips or resources do you have to help foster assertiveness?
I love that. It can be hard too when you think about those naturally shy or soft-spoken, or not used to practicing their own stating what their own needs are, or being that assertive. And I'm wondering too, I think I would have different situations and different suggestions. And if you're trying to get them to foster the assertiveness outwardly, or if you're trying to get them to talk to you more assertively to like help practice that. But I do think something that could be helpful would be this last part down here in the actual items, that very last sentence, anticipate what others need. And I know that sounds kind of silly, but in your conversations with them, if you could ask like leading questions, or ask like, hey, so I'm noticing that these things are coming up. What would you need to make blah, blah, blah happen? Or in your mind, what would the perfect outcome for this be? Almost a little bit of, you are having a growth conversation with them, but you're almost kind of leading them with your questions into being able to articulate themselves better. And then at the end, if it's possible to reflect what you've heard. So to say, well, I really love that you said that you want our office to do this, and in your mind, you would love these two people to be on the project, and the things that you're concerned about is this. How can I help you make that happen? And so almost taking bits and pieces of what they might give you in that conversation and rephrasing it for them at the end to allow them to hear like, wow, yeah, that is what I wanted to say. And those are all the things I wanted. It's a lot of, I would say, effort on your part to kind of coach them through and handhold that quickly. That drawn out wise, and to do that with every single thing would be difficult. So I definitely think maybe it could be a good opportunity to get everyone in the same room and maybe find some silly, I know they're silly, I need to look into it. I know there's silly icebreakers or silly things you could do to practice basically saying something that is either a little ludicrous or a little kind of confrontational, and hearing how other people respond to that, and just giving them that really good feedback of either a laugh or that good conversation, that good meaning making with each other, to allow them to see like, this is something we want from you, and we like that from you, and we expect this from everyone. Almost ties back into our other question, which Cherie said, you know, how do we make sure it's an office norm that everyone knows how to speak up for themselves? And I really do think most people in our profession, whether they're IT or whether they're someone else, would agree that being able to speak up for yourself is an important thing. So maybe even phrasing it in, hey, I know, like, maybe not even saying like, I think you guys have an issue with this, but saying, hey, I thought it'd be really great if maybe you could help us run a workshop about how to speak up for yourself, because I want to make sure everyone feels good in this team about being able to talk about, you know, what they want, or representing us outwardly to other campus partners, and maybe giving them the reins to see what they do with it. There are multiple ways you could go there. And I think without knowing the specific situation or the people, I acknowledge that a lot of my suggestions might not be perfect, but I hope that some of that got a little brain juice flowing, and maybe you can utilize something or try out something and see how it goes and kind of go from there.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Stephanie. So it looks like, thank you all so much for joining us for this webinar today. Thank you, Stephanie, for giving us your time. If you have, so this is being recorded, and I'm sending it out to everyone who registered. So you'll please share with your networks and or reach out to Stephanie if you have any follow-up. I know some of what you had, Stephanie, was suggestions to think about for in the future. And yeah. Anyway, feel free to reach out to us. And thank you all so much for giving us some of your time today.
Yeah, I went ahead and just submitted in the chat my email address. So if you do want the PowerPoint just for your own personal use, or you do want just a shorter kind of blurb of those practice questions, I'm happy to send that out. So please just let me know.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You too. Bye.